So this PowerPoint and lecture is from Chapter 3, and it is specifically on attribution theory, which is discussed in Chapter 3. Just goes into a little more detail about it. So let's define attribution theory. It explains how people interpret the causes of behaviors and events, distinguishing between internal, which is also called dispositional, and external, situational attributions. Internal versus external attributions. An internal attribution, which, as it indicated, can also be called a dispositional attribution. Disposition is a person's usual way of feeling or behaving, the tendency of a person to be happy, friendly, or anxious. So internal attribution means that we attribute someone's behavior to their internal characteristics. We attribute it to just who they are. For example, I see Jesse acting rude, and I just assume that's because he's a mean person. I assume it's attributed internally to his disposition. External attribution, on the other hand, which can also be called situational attribution, that's the process of assigning the cause of behavior to a situation outside a person's control, rather to an internal characteristic. So an example would be, I see Jesse acting rude again, and I assume it's because he had a bad day, not because he is essentially has a rude disposition, and that's who he is, but just because he had a bad day. So sometimes we attribute behavior to who someone is. Sometimes we attribute it just to, oh, well, the situation, they had a bad day, or they got up late, or something like that. I think this offers a little bit more description of the difference between internal and external dispositional versus situational attribution. So on the left side for dispositional attribution, the little boy's saying, my assignment, and the teacher assumes you're so late, you're a lazy bum. So that's contributing to who the person is. That's who he is. He's just lazy. On the other hand, if it was situational attribution, he's turning in a late assignment, and she thinks, oh, well, maybe it was a family issue. So she's not assuming that he's just lazy in general. It could have been the situation. He could have had a family issue or gotten up late. So those are the differences between dispositional and situational attribution. Now, the fundamental attribution error states, when explaining someone's behavior, we often underestimate the impact of the situation and overestimate the extent to which it reflects the individual's traits and attitudes. So, research has found that we often attribute someone else's behavior to their internal characteristics, who they are. However, it seems the opposite is true when we consider our own behavior. We're more likely to attribute our own behavior to external issues. So why do we do that? Why do we look at other people and think their behavior is just a product of who they are, and yet our own behavior is a product of their environment, of the situation? Why do we do that? When we act, the environment commands our attention. When we watch another person act, that person occupies the center of our attention, and the environment becomes relatively invisible. If I'm mad, it's the situation that's making me angry. But someone else getting mad may just seem like an ill-tempered person. So when we're looking at someone else, we don't focus on the environment as much. We focus on the person. So therefore, we tend to attribute any behavior, negative or positive, to the person, not to the environment. There are cultural differences. Members of a very individualistic culture tend to assume someone else's behavior is due to internal characteristics. Individualistic cultures are those that stress the needs of the individual over the needs of the group as a whole. Collectivistic cultures, people less often perceive others in terms of personal dispositions. And a collectivist culture prioritizes the needs and goals of the group as a whole over the needs and desires of each individual. In such societies, relationships and other members of the group and the interconnectedness among its people play a central role in each person's identity, instead of an individualistic culture who focuses on the individual in himself or herself. So why is knowledge of the attribution theory important? Why should we know that we do this? Understanding attribution theory can make a big difference in how we relate to the people around us, especially our closest loved ones. The way we explain behavior influences how we feel, how we act, and how we communicate. Let's say your partner is forgetful. If you attribute it to their busy schedule, external, you're more likely to be understanding. But if you assume they're just being a careless person, they always do this, you might feel frustrated or hurt. These little shifts in our thinking can make a big difference in how we react. And the same goes for workplace dynamics. How managers attribute employee performance can influence decisions around promotions, feedback, and support. If your manager attributes your performance to temporary factors like stress, it's just bad home life, bad day, they might offer you support. However, assuming your performance concerns your character or ability, it's just who you are, you're just a bad performer, might lead to unfair judgments. Increased understanding can pave the way for better collaboration and more effective leadership. Beware of the fundamental attribution error of attributing other people's behavior to intrinsic characteristics rather than possible external factors. Such bias has caused many unnecessary misunderstandings in relationships. So it's an important thing to be aware of because, again, like the last slide mentioned, it affects how we communicate with each other, especially how we communicate with people close to us. So thank you for listening to a little bit about the fundamental attribution theory. Let me know if you have any questions.